Now, the government's green policies are costing jobs and hollowing out working-class communities. That's the warning from the leader of one of Britain's largest unions this week. Gary Smith from the GMB trade union warned that the ambition of achieving net zero within 6 years could cost thousands of jobs, as well as raise energy prices, hitting the poorest the hardest. Well, the target for removing fossil fuels from UK electricity production was brought forward by 5 years by the new Labour government to 2030, after the previous Tory government had vowed to do it by 2035. But with climate change an increasing concern, do we all need to be prepared to make sacrifices, or are we trying to reach net zero too quickly? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Ross Clark, author and journalist of Not Zero, Dr. Kush from the campaign group Just Stop Oil, Melanie Nazareth, a campaigner from Christian Climate Action, and Inaya Folarin Iman, who is a broadcaster and journalist. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming in. Kush, in his speech, which I mentioned from Gary Smith, he added, we are going to see a huge reductions in our emissions, but at what price? So would thousands of jobs and higher bills be a price worth paying for you?
Well, so I come at this from the health angle, working as a doctor. And what health leaders are saying is that we are addicted to fossil fuels, and that then comes with the biggest threat to human health of our generation. And the reason for that is that the fossil fuel industry has spent decades downplaying the risks of the climate crisis. And what that has meant is that people have been first frankly denying the effects of climate change, but now trying to go towards delaying action on climate change.
So I'll go to my question, are lots of job losses a price worth paying?
Well, I think you have to look at what is the alternative. The alternative is that we delay action that then leads to us hitting these tipping points that send us towards climate collapse.
You're happy to lose lots of jobs?
Millions of people will die if we do not take action on the climate crisis. So I don't see it as a either or. I see it as we need to take action, and you also need to look at the benefits of taking that climate action. You can't just look at what the costs are. I'd see it as a health investment and saying that we're protecting people's lives, and that's why we need to take action.
I mean, hearing Kush there, jobs are obviously important, but actually this is much bigger than that. And actually, when you look at a report from the Climate Change Committee, this is the government's independent energy advisory board, it says that more jobs will be created, Ross, rather than lost in the net zero transition, somewhere between 135,000 and, get this, 725,000. What are we waiting for? Let's get on with it.
Yeah, the Green Lobby's been telling us this for years, haven't it? You know, go net zero, it'll create all these thousands of green jobs. Well, it is creating green jobs, but most of them are in China, actually. On most matters of public policy, it's accepted there is a trade-off. There are costs on one side, there are benefits on the other side, and, you know, you have to try and find a balance somewhere. But when it comes to net zero, or anything green, really, all that seems to go out of the window. And if you listen to Ed Miliband and many ministers in the previous government, it has to be said, they don't seem to believe that. They think, oh, we'll go to net zero, it's going to create loads of jobs, it's going to lower energy prices, it's just all benefit.
So what do you mean create jobs in China? I don't explain that.
Well, if you look at where all the solar panels are manufactured, where increasing a proportion of the wind turbines are manufactured, it's in China.
But they don't have to be. They could be jobs that we're creating.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the reason they're being created in China, partly because obviously labour costs are lower there, but also because energy costs are lower there. And why are energy costs lower in China? Because 60% of their energy is still generated by coal. So it's not even, we're not even importing. There's a lot of embedded emissions in those stuff we're importing.
Melanie, is this just an idea, middle-class idea, politicians' idea, and actually working-class communities are going to pay for it?
Absolutely not. I have seen with my own eyes that devastation that was wreaked in communities in County Durham and the northeast of England by the mine closures. You can still see the devastation and deprivation in those communities.
So this is
it's
going to repeat
outrageous.
That, isn't it?
No, that's what we need to make sure doesn't happen. And the government absolutely have to commit to an investment programme that brings manufacturing back to the UK. So at the moment, we could bring wind power manufacturing to the UK. We could invest 2 billion, small amount of the windfall profits that energy companies made at the expense of people's higher energy bills. And we could create jobs, we could create investment, we could create energy security by doing that. We just need to bring proper investment into the UK, and this is what this government must commit to. Yeah. And then it's a false argument. Net zero on one hand and jobs on the other. We should stop having this political football and work out how to join the two together, because it is possible to join them together.
I mean, listening to Melanie, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That's make the wind turbines here. That's, that's grasp it. Let's go for it, full throttle.
Well, I mean, look, what Kush was saying, I think, really highlights the problem. We're talking about a very complex and very large policy challenge here. And anyone that doesn't agree with the specific approach to it, which is net zero by 2030, necessarily means that you're going to support the destruction of the planet. I mean, that's just patently absurd. Any politician has to triangulate a whole host of factors, jobs, energy bills, and the transition in terms of what's appropriate. And the reality is actually this push for net zero has actually made it much more difficult to transition to greener, cleaner energy sources. So take something like nuclear, because it wasn't seen as pure enough for many of the green activists, we have kicked that issue into the long grass. And the reality is, wind, solar and power, we have not solved the intermittency problem. So we are going to need fossil fuels for a very long time. And rather than having a realistic conversation about a whole range of energy sources, we've just decided that these are the perfect ones. We should push for that. And that's just going to make bills much more expensive, because we're still going to need other sources.
But we can't... Just let Kush just respond.
We can't kick this into the long grass, because the effects of the climate crisis are here already. We're seeing the number of people who are suffering from malnutrition and starving already increased by more than 300 million as a direct effect of the climate crisis.
This idea that Britain moving the deadline by a few years is going to be the very reason that's going to cause this planet to destroy.
It can't be Britain doing this alone.
It's just not a sensible conversation.
It can't be Britain doing this alone, and that's why what Just Stop Oil is calling for is that Britain sign up to an international
What about North Sea oil? Would you be OK with losing thousands
treaty?
of jobs there, which depends on loads of communities for their livelihood, for their family life, for high school jobs? You're very happy to stop that, aren't you?
I'm not happy to stop it, but I see...
But you support it.
Can I just put a point to you, Kush, then, in terms of us, the UK, as global players? I mean, we're a really small nation, and the UK emits around 1% of global CO2 emissions. It's really small compared to the USA and China. So you'd be forgiven with people who think, say, working in a working-class community, you said Durham earlier, Melanie,
we
who
can't
think,
do this alone.
why are we paying the price for this when everybody else is saying we're going to do it at 2050? Because most countries are putting it off many years later.
So first of all, we can't do this alone, and therefore we don't just want the UK going off on its own doing this. Just Stop Oil is saying that the UK needs to sign up to a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, saying that agreeing with leading countries around the world that we need to have a clear plan for everybody to get off oil and gas.
Let's let Melanie
say that we managed to export the Industrial Revolution. We exported lots of things, and we're a small country. We can do this again. We can export a green revolution. We can be the leaders that show how it can be done. And what's more, if you're in a playground and there are some big kids pushing the little kids around, sometimes you have to be brave and you have to get in there and you have to say, this isn't right, you have to intervene. We can do that. We're a nation that has a conscience.
We're not going to be exporting any industrial revolution when we have industrial energy prices which are the highest in the developed world, and that's a figure that came out last week. Why do we have... And yet, we have the cleanest energy in the developed world. We've got the most wind farms. We've got, we've got a lot of solar, and why are our energy prices
Ross,
so high?
I'm hearing solutions from Melanie. What are the solutions from you then? What would you say if we're going to push net zero back?
Well, I'd say, invest in technology and let those technologies, give them space to prove themselves. Otherwise, you just jump at the wrong technologies. And, for example, 50 years ago, we were having this conversation. We'd be talking about nuclear fusion and that it was going to be the answer to everything and everything. We're still here now. Nuclear fusion still is not a you know, a viable option yet, but it may be in future. And if it does become an option, nobody will ever want to build another wind farm again or a solar farm. You know, that will be the standard of electricity that we use.
So Melanie, just looking at the Earth Trust, this is a charity aimed at preserving our natural spaces, has said, to put it bluntly, what happens in the next 5 years will determine the world our children and their children will inhabit. When you hear Ross speaking there, do we have time for that sort of thing?
We don't have time. And what is more important is that we have solutions available to us now. We have to invest in them. And maybe nuclear fusion will be something that we will look at in the future. But there are solutions we can use now to address this problem that is so, so important, because what we're facing is not just global warming, but the possibility that we're approaching tipping points, which will cause global systems to shut down.
No, this is going into exaggeration.
It is a possibility. I'm not saying these things are what climate scientists are saying.
So, Inaya, that quote that I had there, to put it bluntly, what happens in the next 5 years will determine what happens for our children and our children's children. I mean, that's pretty scary stuff, isn't it?
Look, this has been said for decades. I mean, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, it was 5 minutes to midnight, and, you know, it's constantly ramping up this kind of existential crisis so that we don't actually have a level-headed conversation about the realities and the trade-offs and all of the different impacts. It just becomes, we must do this now, and if anyone disagrees, you're a climate denier, you're a climate sceptic, and you should be pushed out of the conversation. I don't think that that's the right way of approaching it.
Is that fair? Because people do have concerns, and it's not that they're climate change deniers. They just want to do it in a different way, and they're just labelled.
We need to be honest about the threat that we face. And actually, even very reasonable people like David Attenborough are saying that we see the end of cities and societies, and shortly after that, civilization breaking down because of the effects of the climate crisis. So I think unless you are honest about the threat that you face, you cannot motivate the necessary action. And when you talked about the cost of energy being cheaper with coal, oil or gas, that's only because you're not actually looking at the real cost that burning all of that will have. Once you factor those things in, it's without a doubt makes far more sense to rely on renewables.
No, see, what you're doing is what climate campaigners have done over and over again, trying to close down the debate, saying, you know, oh, the costs of climate change are so enormous that we can't afford not to do it. And you get into this sort of hyperbole situation where you're, you know, claiming we've got 5 minutes to save the world. Then, you know, the number of times I've heard that deadline put forward.
It's the
and it's simply not true.
The consensus of
no,
scientists
and if you actually want to go and read the climate science,
needs to be taken this decade.
When you actually read the climate science, you find that the sort of changes are very, you know, there's some are beneficial, some are, you know, very much the other way. And
you cannot.
The number of times I've heard this figure saying billions of people are going to die, and you say, what are billions of people going to die of? And they say, oh, the heat. And then you look at the actual data and you see that the number of people dying of heat is rising a little bit.
Okay.
The number of people dying of the cold is decreasing at a far
You compare a milder temperature in Scotland as a benefit with when the trade-off is billions of people dying.
Even in Africa, more people die of the cold than die of the heat, and that, you know, the trend is, you know, people die.
Melanie,
flooding and disease and all these things that are on the rise. What about the impact of the climate chaos?
Did you say flooding's on the rise? Where's your data for saying that? No, I'll tell you. You go to the IPCC report.
Recently, people can see it.
No, go to the IPCC report.
I have read it.
No.
Okay,
And I'll tell you, the one study that has compared the maximum.
I want to finish, round off on a question, actually, with you, Melanie. Last week, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said, God is green and he calls us to be green. Do you see this as part of your faith and to be environmentally focused, and should all Christians be like that?
I think this is the question of the integrity of creation, which is what we call it, is fundamental to Christian belief. God created this wonderful gift to humanity. God created the richness and biodiversity, and we are destroying that. The incredible hubris that makes human beings stand against God who created these wonderful things just floors me. Yeah. And yes, we have a duty to preserve what God loves, and God loves the earth.
I know you're chomping at the bit to get in, and I definitely, but I'm afraid that is all we have got time for. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, Holly, what are people saying at home?
Yeah, a variety of opinions on home. Stephen's been in touch on X. He says reaching net zero creates new jobs. Making sure that people can access those jobs is a crucial part of reaching net zero, not a reason to not do it. Peter's been in touch on email, though. He says we are trying to reach net zero too quickly. I think we shouldn't increase energy bills to rush to reach net zero. Thank you for all your thoughts on that. We do have plenty more of the week's big stories on the show today, including a discussion on whether fewer female offenders should be sent to jail. This